Welcome to the Bagel Logic Podcast, the show where Papa Thom spreads wisdom like a smear of cream cheese on an everything bagel. Here's your host, Thom Jennings.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Bagel Logic Podcast, and I just want to say thank you to everybody that has reached out to me so far with some great feedback. I really appreciate it. It, kind of drives me, and I've been very, I'm not going to lie, I obsess over the statistics, and I look at the listens and all that every day, sometimes 2 and 3 times a day. So I've been very happy with how the show has grown. People are clearly going back into the archives, listening to some of the earlier shows. The shows with guests, I think, have come out really well. I've had 2 guests so far, Chris Hasnauer and Bruce Wojcik, and they were absolutely wonderful, both of them. But today's topic is, and this will just be a show with me, and this is a topic I'm sure that I'll revisit again and again. We've already talked about the politics. So as a bartender, it's one of the things that people will say to you is there's 2 topics you should never discuss in a bar, and that's politics and religion. And actually, the place I work in a town called Medina, New York, and the venue, bar, tasting room. It's a meadery, MEAD, and it has it really is a very interesting place. It's more like a Cheers atmosphere. So we're able to talk politics and religion and disagree on things and whatnot. So again, today is a podcast about religion, and I will just put a little bit of a disclaimer up front. I don't intend to offend anybody. If for some reason something I say is counter to your beliefs, or maybe if there's something that I say misrepresents a particular church or religion or whatever, feel free to reach out to me. I'd be happy to engage in a discussion. So everything I'm going to be discussing today really is on a personal level. It's personal experiences, and I think in many ways we, as a race, as the human race, sometimes we get caught up in religion as this experience that has to be communal, when in so many ways it's more meaningful when it's personal. And, I was raised Catholic. My uncle was a priest. I wasn't like one of those kids that dragged to church every Sunday. My mother was German ancestry. My dad was Irish ancestry. So strong Catholic background. They had the very traditional Catholic beliefs in terms of, the sacraments and things like that. And obviously, with my mom having a brother who was a Catholic priest, Catholicism was a very important part of her growing up. In terms of my family, we had kind of a weird experience because my dad was an alcoholic, and it's where I think people think alcoholics, and I know there's so many different variations of alcoholism. I mean, there's alcoholics that drink all the time in OAs and never quit drinking, but are kind of passive aggressive. My dad was a little bit different in that he was the kind of guy that he was what we like to call a mean drunk. And not trying to disparage my dad. I loved him. By the time he passed, we were very close, and I still miss him. I still think of him pretty much every day, and enjoyed a lot of our conversations later on in life. But when I was a young man, he would get really drunk and get kind of violent and mean, but eventually his drinking and combined with some mental health problems put him in a position where he couldn't work anymore. He was on Social Security disability. And I think that this led to a little bit of embarrassment. So he didn't really want to go out in public. And like, even when I was a kid, we weren't able to have anybody over to the house. Like, I couldn't have friends come and spend the night, and we didn't really socialize with our family members. So in terms of like our church going, it was kind of a weird dynamic between my parents because, here's my mom. She's got a brother who's a priest, and, everybody in the family is all super Catholic. And then my dad, his family was actually lived, 7 or 8 hours away. So he wasn't really feeling that same kind of Catholic pressure. But they at least felt enough pressure that we had to go through the whole Catholic things, the major sacraments. So the first communion, first penance, all myself and my siblings, we were all baptized Catholic. And, if it was a situation where I was getting around the age, for instance, for confirmation, the priest would inevitably say, well, your kid's going to confirmation, it can be confirmed. I mean, you need to start coming to church and bringing the kid to church so that it's not him just showing up for confirmation classes and you guys taking off. So our church attendance was very sporadic. And it was weird, too, because my mom, we had two different parishes that we kind of parish hopped in this town, Brighton, New York, which is a suburb of Rochester. One was St. Thomas More Church. And my parents got married there, and, the kids were all baptized there. So that was to me, that was my favorite church. This giant crucifix, and Jesus was at the front of the church. And I always looked up at the Jesus hanging off the cross there, and that was Jesus. So that was my vision of Jesus. And if I prayed, I was praying to that image of Jesus. And then every now and then we'd go to this other church called Our Lady of Lourdes, which was in the same town, but in a different section of town. And that had, it was a little more modern. And I didn't really think that, I just didn't feel churchy to me. So I liked these really ornate Catholic churches. That's kind of where my Jesus comfort zone was, if you will. And when I went for First Communion, I was typical age and everything. And then because of our sporadic attendance, I never was able to do first penance or first confession at the prescribed age, which I don't even remember what the heck it was. And so when I had to do the confirmation stuff, I had skipped the penance, so I had to do them both at the same time. But either way, I was confirmed, and this was something that was really important to my parents. But I think because of the whole conflicted nature of my parents' relationship with the Catholic Church, I kind of felt the same way. So I wasn't one of those kids that grew up with, a lot of people talk about the guilt and all this other stuff that's associated with growing up Catholic. And I certainly dealt with a certain degree of that, but I didn't understand a lot of the criticisms that people that grew up Catholic had about the church because I really just wasn't all that entrenched in the church. So, but having a bit of a chaotic childhood, as I mentioned, with a father who was an alcoholic, and I was a bit of a rebellious child. I was certainly curious about religion, especially the whole, New Testament and everything. And I lived in a community where I had a lot of friends who were Jewish, so we would have a lot of conversations in regard to the difference between Judaism and Catholicism, and then I honestly, it's as I think back, I don't remember having a lot of Protestant friends. I wasn't really exposed to Protestantism until I was around 15, 16 years old. And my first exposure to Protestantism was in the form of a street preacher. And I remember it vividly. I was in the city of Rochester, and there was a friend of mine that was with me. His name is John Kane. He's Jewish, and I'm Catholic. And we were downtown, and I was about 14, 15 years old. We were waiting for a bus. And in downtown Rochester, this has got to be 1979, 1980, 81, around that era. They used to have a ton of these guys on the street corner that would hand you tracts. It's tracts. I don't know. It's such a weird word for me to pronounce. But anyhow, they would hand you these religious tracts, and then they'd give you, a quickie attempt at conversion or whatnot. I didn't really pay a lot of attention. It's funny. Just like 2 days ago, I was shopping in Walmart, and I'm walking down the aisle, and some guy just stares at me with this just weird look, and he just sticks his hand out, and he's holding a calendar, and I looked at the calendar, and on the other side it was, do you know if you're going to heaven? It was one of those kind of things like that. And so I would be exposed to a lot of that. I mean, I used to spend a lot of time in downtown Rochester. I used to run into these street preachers all the time. So one day I was there with me and my buddy John Kane, and this guy, handed a tract. And John was one of these guys that he loved to debate, argue, and engage people, especially people that were just hanging out on the street. And so he started asking questions, and this guy's like, what faith are you? He's like, well, I'm Jewish. He goes, well, do you believe in Jesus as your personal savior? And he's like, no, I'm Jewish. He's like, well, if you say a prayer with me now and accept Jesus as your personal savior, you'll go to heaven and all your sins will be forgiven. So he was like, oh, so if I just say a prayer with you now on the street corner, I'm good. Like I get to go to heaven. But if I don't, I'm condemned to an eternity in hell. The guy's like, well, yeah, that's the case. He says, well, that doesn't make any sense to me. I mean, what? What if I just do the prayer with you right now and it doesn't mean anything to me? Am I still going to go to heaven just because I said your prayer? So it was one of those kind of back and forth engagements, and it stuck with me for a long time. And I always felt very conflicted about it because I think I understood it on some level. And these street corner preachers can be incredibly, incredibly convincing. And I think it's because they have such conviction. I mean, many of them really, really have a great deal of faith. They believe in what they're doing. And man, if you think about it, like if your mission is to save somebody's soul from eternal damnation, I mean, that's got to be pretty motivating. And as I said, as somebody who didn't spend a lot of time in church, I was always very curious. Now, when I got a little bit older, I dated this young lady, and her mother, she was Mormon, but her mother had rejected the Mormon church around that time and was attending this Pentecostal Christian place in Rochester. And I mean, I had never been exposed to anything like this before. So I went with her mother and her to this church. Now, truth be told, many years later, as I look back on it, think about it, I'm 16 years old. She was just a beautiful, beautiful girl. And I was, I guess the term would be smitten. I was very smitten by her. And I pretty much would have done anything to spend time with her and eventually become her boyfriend. So, I mean, having to go to this church, I mean, I went. But you get into, I remember the building, it was just this giant, this cavernous church. And, if you know anything about the contrast between like a Catholic service, maybe a Baptist, Jewish service, and these Pentecostal services, it's very stark. So I grew up with the Catholic Church, which is fairly reserved. There's a lot of ceremony, ritual. I mean, they would have a homily, which is it's kind of a fancy word for sermon, and in many times that's where you were supposed to get your life lesson or whatever. I was usually mentally checked out. I really didn't listen to that portion of it. And I mean, I just knew the phases of the ceremony and would just sort of be counting down the time when I'd get out of church. I mean, that was my goal was like, oh, well, we're doing the homilies. Now I figure we got about 15, 20 minutes to get out. And it's funny because my mother used to say the same thing. She'd be like, well, that was great. It was a short homily today. We got out of church 10, 15 minutes early. And then I went to some temple services, and they were kind of the same thing. I mean, I don't really remember a lot about the rituals and whatnot, but they still felt very formal, very reserved. And then I went to this Pentecostal thing. Now, the guy that was the pastor, he was He's got this really nice suit on. I mean, he's just dressed to the nines, and he's had this perfect hair. I mean, he almost, as I look back on it, he almost reminded me of Thom Selleck. I mean, he had that kind of good looks. So a lot of charisma, and the whole service. I mean, this place actually was the first time, and I don't know if I've ever even been anywhere else since then, come to think of it, where I got to see people that were speaking in tongues, which just freaked me right out. I was we were sitting up in the balcony and everything, and then there's just some lady that stands up and she starts, saying stuff. I got no idea what's going on. And then then I hear later, that's somebody speaking in tongues. And so this person will speak in tongues, and then this person will interpret it. I'm like, wow, this is just crazy. And, eventually, if I was going to continue in a relationship with this young lady, I was going to have to continue going to the church. So I continued to go to the church. And in some ways, I guess I had a bit of a religious conversion. They used to do these things called altar calls, where at the end of the service, and man, if you see one, it's just so powerful. I mean, they draw you right in and hit your soul where it counts. They're like, hey, if you're concerned about where you're going to go when you die, all that kind of stuff, then come on up and we'll pray with you and you'll be saved. And yeah, I did it. I was like, wow, this was a very powerful conversion moment, I suppose. So in terms of my experience with early experiences with Christianity, and it's funny because in some ways I think the Protestant church has a very conflicted view on the Catholic Church, and I'll get to that in a moment because I think that's sort of at the heart of this week's show, is the idea of churches and their relationships with people. They a lot of them, they would say, oh, well, if you're Catholic, then you're not a Christian and you're not saved and you're going to go to hell, basically. Eternal damnation. And so it's weird because I think this message it's a dangerous one on some level, because where it was always an issue with me mentally was that my family was Catholic. Like my dad's Catholic, my mom's Catholic, and my uncle, a lot of my friends were Catholic. And so with some of these Protestant churches that just openly spouted anti-Catholic rhetoric, it was like they were insulting my family members. And in some ways, they were insulting me. I mean, to this day, if you were to ask me what church that I feel most comfortable in, it's definitely a Catholic church, without a doubt. And it took me a long time to kind of get to that point. It was a long journey, but there's a comfort there. Whatever. I mean, I don't know if I can necessarily put it into words other than to say that it's going back to what I said earlier. It's that your relationship in terms of religion and your faith is something that it's personal. It's not cookie cutter. It's not as easy as just having some guy hand you a piece of paper on a street corner and having you say, oh, Jesus is my Savior and I'm going to go to heaven now, and no matter what I do, my sins will be forgiven and all that. But if I don't do that, I could still be a good person. But if I don't accept Jesus as my Savior, then I'm still potentially gonna go to hell if I just stay in the Catholic Church. And I suppose to some degree there's a bit of an oversimplification in that characterization of the Protestant view on Catholics. But again, this is my personal experience. This is how I've felt. And I think that one of the things that churches tend to overlook when they're bringing in new members or trying to recruit people and they're trying to grow is that there are a lot of people that may start out in a particular branch of religion. Maybe it's Mormon, maybe it's Jewish, maybe it's Catholic or whatever. And you can still have your message and not condemn everybody else as just being heretics or wrong. And I think that there's a school of thought out there that I hear, where they say, no, you have to really just attack these other faiths as being absolutely wrong and us being the one true faith, or the message is just too wishy-washy. And I don't believe that. And I think that is at the core of why I don't belong to a church any longer. And I've belonged to, as far as, the Catholic Church. As I mentioned, I went to Catholic Church when I was younger. I wasn't really a member of that big Pentecostal church that I told you about. I did attend there. I was a member of a Baptist church in Rochester, and that was because I had a neighbor, and I used to walk my dog every day, and I would see this guy sitting on the doorstep, and he was a nice guy, and we became friends. I mean, not super close friends, but he was always sitting on his front step, and he was always reading the Bible, and we would have these conversations, and it was a little more personal than the fire and brimstone street corner guy. And he invited us, myself and my wife at the time, to go to his church, and we went to that church. It was as I said, it was a Baptist church. It it might have been Southern Baptist, I don't remember, but fairly good cross section of people. It wasn't overly white, wasn't overly minority. It was in a city setting, kind of an older building. The congregants everybody seemed to kind of get along. I mean, we got along with some people, and really the only reason that we eventually stopped attending that church is because I'll tell you that the pastor there, now he was one of these kind of soft-spoken guys who really delivered some excellent, I would consider, educational Bible stuff. I mean, he wasn't one of those guys that necessarily sat there and did a whole, sermon on this is bad, this is good, and yada, yada. I mean, he would usually go through a series of lectures on a book of the Bible and then somehow relate that to what was going on in the everyday world. But his big thing was this dude was a master of getting to the whole concept of tithing, which was 10% of your income going to the church. So no matter what, every week, the message would somehow always find its way back to, you got to make sure that you're giving 10% of your income to the church. If you do, you're going to be blessed and your financial situation will be taken care of. God will take care of you. God will bless you. Now, this is going to sound utterly bizarre and potentially unbelievable, but it's the truth. While I attended that church, I indeed was so convinced that the 10% tithe was like that was legit what he was saying. If I give 10% of my income, that I'll be blessed and we won't have financial troubles or any of that kind of stuff. And so I set up, I took my checking account information, gave it to the church, and gave 10% of my income to the church while we were members there. And during that period of time where I was tithing, I never had any major financial problems. And I still look back on that as, I don't know if it was coincidence. I don't know, maybe if there was a portion of it that was because I was, maybe it was, they say it was psychosomatic. Once you're convinced that something can happen, it'll happen. Even in the Bible, they talk about, faith the size of a mustard seed can move a mountain. And I've always been very conflicted about that because I feel like on some level that churches do get a deservedly bad rap for getting people to donate money on a regular basis and then squandering it, the church itself. And it doesn't really seem, it doesn't seem to really make sense that you have to give your money to a church and that's the only way God's going to make sure that you're okay financially. That concept is kind of weird on a lot of levels, but the way it gets presented kind of makes sense because they're saying, well, if you give 10% of your income, that's showing your faith, and your faith will be rewarded. And I don't know, it worked for us for a while, and I've never, and the funny thing is I don't think there's ever a scenario where I would consider giving 10% of my income to a church again. I just wouldn't do it. Because I've also experienced, I've had some firsthand knowledge of some church officials that spend money very recklessly, and I would rather give my money to a charity that I know is doing things that are really beneficial for the community and not necessarily for the church itself. And I used to read a lot of books. In fact, after the Baptist church. Now, the reason I left that Baptist church is that they wound up raising just oodles of money, and they built this fancy new church that was out in the suburbs, and it really just changed the dynamic of the church. It went from this kind of scrappy bunch of people in the middle of the city in this sort of rundown building to this palace of a church, and it was like, man, it just didn't feel good anymore, I mean, I get it that you got to keep the lights on, you got to pay the pastor and all that stuff, but man, when you go from, I mean, some of the books that I used to read about this stuff, and it made sense. I mean, the worst thing you can do as a church is become obsessed with your building, because then it becomes all about the building and having this great looking building, and then that's what you are. You're not a church. You're not a charitable organization. You're just figuring out a way to perpetuate your growth through the same way a sports team would. Yeah, we need a new stadium. We need a new church. And so that's kind of why I became alienated. There were some other circumstances as well that I don't need to get into now. But and then the next church I went to was a Lutheran church, and it was part of the Lutheran Missouri Synod. And I'll tell you what I liked about the Lutheran Missouri Synod Church is that it was really kind of Catholic light. It had a lot of the structure and a lot of the things that I was used to in the Catholic Church, but it wasn't as airtight, and stiff in terms of the religious ceremony. And it was during that period of time, I think that a church is really a reflection of its pastor. And the guy that was the pastor of this church, he was just a great guy. Like, I just really, as a human being, I just loved him. And it wasn't because he had this big personality or because he was uber charismatic or anything. He was just a really kind of a chill guy. He was really down to earth. And anytime I had a personal issue or a question, whether it was something to do with faith or just, I was a young person at the time. I was in my late 20s, going into my early 30s, and I was a young parent. He was somebody that I could approach. I could trust him because he never told people my business or any of that stuff. So he was a great counselor. And then eventually he became a mentor. And as I mentioned on a previous episode, and I dropped out of high school when I was 16 years old, and I was always very self-conscious about that. This pastor had seen something in me that he thought that I had the talent and skills to be a pastor at a Lutheran church. And so I got an uncle who's a priest. I'm thinking, well, this is kind of in my blood. And I really loved public speaking. I loved being self-taught when it came to things. So I do a lot of reading. But he was just a really great mentor. And he really just took me under his wing. He was very non-judgmental. But the problem that was going on at the time in that particular church is that there was an associate pastor who was very popular, and he was kind of the more charismatic of the two, and there were people that really liked him, and, these churches, sometimes they're just a reflection of like society as a whole. They're like a high school. They have little cliques and groups of people that just can't get along within the church itself. And so the associate pastor, he was, and this is all from memory, but I'm pretty sure the facts are accurate, that the associate pastor was having an affair with the wife of one of the church board members. And they were found out, and it created this whole debate within the church itself. Now, the guy that was the pastor, the one I spoke about that I really looked up to, I mean, his idea was, look, dude, you know what? You're having an affair, you're engaged in adultery, and you can't be the pastor of the church right now until you take care of this situation. So maybe you should take a leave of absence and deal with whatever you're dealing with in terms of your own marriage, and of course not damaging somebody else's marriage in the process as well. And then we'll see what we can do later on down the road. Well, there was a whole group within the congregation that was like, well, that's not very Christ-like. I mean, everybody sins. We're all sinners and we all can be forgiven. And, you're just trying to drive this guy out and you're being too judgmental. And it's like, man, it was to me, even if I was an atheist, I would say from an outsider's perspective that if you're a pastor and you're engaged in an adulterous affair, then you gotta go. You just gotta go. And I don't know. It was a really weird situation. But the guy did eventually leave, but there was a lot of resentment. And with the associate pastor leaving, the head pastor, they didn't want to replace the associate pastor because they didn't have the money for it. Because this pastor wasn't as good as getting 10% out of people as the pastor was at the Baptist church. But I will say for this church, I gave 5%. It's funny. I always remember justifying that. I'm like, I'm not going to give them the full 10% because, I always felt like that they just took my money the last time and just built a new church. So I'll start out giving 5% of my income and hopefully I'll grow into 10%. But anyhow, so they did have a void that needed to be filled. And so he asked me if I would be willing to do some sermons, to give some sermons. And I was like, sure, I'll give it a try. And it was something that I really enjoyed. And I think at that time, my faith really grew. And then there came a point where I wanted to pursue the ministry. And he strongly encouraged me. And then there was a program. It was a distance learning program that I applied to. I went and took a visit to the seminary. I mean, I hobnobbed with all the leaders in the church, and I got to know all the regional pastors and everything. I mean, it was like I was on a tour of like a political tour, like I was trying to get elected to something. But I met all these people and went to their convention in St. Louis, and met the leader of the Missouri Synod, and everything seemed to be kind of going in that direction. And it was like I was thinking, you hear all these stories like, oh, it's your calling, and God is calling you to do this and whatnot. And so we were just getting to the point where it looked like things were going well, and my pastor at that point, he decided that he wanted to do mission work overseas in Kyrgyzstan, so I was going to lose him. And he says, oh, it's okay. We'll see if we can get you at least into the program so you can study for the ministry. So I applied for the program, and they told me that they were rejecting me because they didn't feel that I could complete work at the college level. And that they were concerned about my background as a Catholic. So it was like the Catholic thing came back to haunt me again, which at the time I remember hearing it going, wow, really? Like, is this a thing? Like, is this thing like Catholic? Like, they really think my Catholic back? And it's funny because a lot of these Missouri Synod Lutheran, there were people in the Missouri Synod Lutheran Church that, Catholic was a dirty word. I think they really hated Catholics more than they hated any other branch of the faith. There was other branches of Lutheranism that they weren't fond of, but man, did they hate them Catholics. And I don't know. I found the Missouri Synod form of Lutheranism to be so close to Catholic. I just found it utterly bizarre. I still find it bizarre that, you had all this infighting in Ireland for years as a young person whose dad was Irish and grandparents was Irish, and you'd hear these stories about how the Protestants and Catholics can't get along in Ireland. I'm like, man, how is this a thing? This doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But so eventually, that just didn't work out. I stayed at the church. I still did. I still preached. I actually preached at other churches. Then they got mad at me because I was preaching at a Presbyterian church that had hired me for 6 weeks. And then my wife at the time, she had an affair, so that got out. And then the pastor called me in and said, hey, we can't let you continue to preach because your wife's having an affair. And it's gotten back to us, and if you can't be the Lord of your house, you can't be the Lord over this house. I mean, I'll never forget that line. Who says that? If you can't be the Lord of your own house, you can't be the Lord over this house. So that ended my relationship with the Missouri Synod Lutheran Church. And I mean, for many years, I didn't go to church. I didn't go to church for... wow, I want to say 15 years after that. And when I finally decided to take another stab at going to church, I went into it with a lot of that baggage. And I mean, the good thing, I look back on those experiences and it kind of goes back to the theme of this particular podcast, in that, I mean, when they looked at me and were like, well, we don't think you can do work at the college level. To me, that was like somebody looking at me saying that, yeah, I don't think you're that smart, dude. I really don't think you're very smart. And you can't, you couldn't do college level coursework. And so when I did eventually go to college, that drove me. I mean, it really did. I don't think there was a day that went by that I didn't think about that. I'm like, I'm going to prove those SOBs wrong. Yeah, I'll do college coursework. And for the record, that's really not necessarily the greatest motivation in the world. I mean, you can't go through your life just doing things because people tell you that you can't do them. I mean, you always have to find motivation from somewhere. That's not a great way to find the motivation. In the end, I mean, I got the diploma, and that's the good thing. But I mean, I wish on some level, the experience was more driven by that, a little bit less by kind of that I'm going to show them attitude, as opposed to this is what I should do because it's the right thing for me to do and it's the right time for me to do it. So I was just not a fan of churches. And here's the thing is, it's tough because it goes back to that whole idea of faith. I spent so much time reading the Bible, so much time studying all these different stories, and so much time even immersed in a lot of it. Because, I mean, I was preparing sermons. And it was a thrilling experience. I loved the history. I loved the lessons, all that stuff. But again, with that comes just the conflicting, pedagogy. And this church reads this passage and interprets it that way. And it's just all those things that everybody in society talks about when they're being critical of churches. I mean, it's all there, and that never went away. And so the next church we joined, I mean, I kind of dipped my toes in the water in terms of our beginning phases, but it turned out to be a pretty horrible experience as well. I mean, we went to the church. I think we met some really nice people. And the way the whole thing started, it was kind of crazy. So my wife and I'm married to now, we were invited to this church by somebody that we were friends with at the time. And then we went a few times. I felt like it was one of those churches. It was a Free Methodist church. It was like, I was very vanilla. So, the sermons were pretty laid back. They weren't too, fire and brimstone. They did the altar call thing, but it wasn't like a hard sell altar call. The music was great. I really loved it. At one point, I was in the music group, and man, did I love playing that Christian music. It's no matter what your faith is, it's just amazing music to play. And so it was. I felt okay there. Like it wasn't one of those churches where I necessarily felt like super comfortable there, because it was like a lot of churches that, in my experience, that I would sort of, a friend would invite me to and say, oh, check it out and see what you think. You feel that, like that pressure to conform, but you also feel that there's groups of people that have been there for so long that if you can't get along with them, it's never going to work. And this church really had a core group of people that were the old guard, and for whatever reason, they never really quite warmed up to me or my wife. I don't know, probably me. But we were considering membership at the church, formal membership, and so we signed up for the membership classes. And at the time, it was only us and another couple. And so we went out to lunch with the other couple and the pastor, and like, this is what we have to do. This is the book you got to read, and so the classes will be 8 weeks. Well, my schedule's a little weird and everything. So instead of doing a formal class, we'll just get together whenever we can get together. So, didn't really think much of it. So then the other couple, they were still going to church. We were going to church, and this went on for weeks and weeks. And then one day we go to church, and they're introducing the new members, and it's the other couple that we were supposed to be going through membership classes with. And I looked at my wife and I go, how the heck did they finish the membership classes? Like, he never called us to tell us that there were classes. Like I just assumed they weren't going on because he was going to tell us what was going on. So somehow the other couple found out about it, but we were never told. And it was weird. Like even when I addressed it, they just kind of were like, I don't know what happened. But it gave me the impression that they just didn't want me to be a member. And in fact, when I joined the church band, then the first 3 weeks they wouldn't have a microphone in front of me. And I said, well, what's the deal with that? And the leader of the praise team is what they called it. He said, well, we can't have a microphone for the first 3 weeks because we had an incident with somebody who had a microphone in front of them and they said something. Like, oh, okay. So you think that I'm just going to randomly in the middle of the church service walk up to the microphone and have some kind of meltdown and talk about how I don't like your church, but whatever, rule's a rule. So then another friend of mine joined the church group, I don't know, 5-6 months later, and there he was up the first week, and he's got a microphone in front of him. So I'm like, what is going on, man? I'm starting to take this stuff really personally. And and then we wound up, my wife and I wound up having there was a huge issue with actually the person that originally had invited us to go to attend church there. And I'd served on a board with him that was not a church board, but it was another function, a not-for-profit. And I busted him stealing. He was stealing money. And I went to the pastor. I explained the situation to him. And I mean, to me, it was pretty cut and dried. I got, here's the bank statements. Here's the money missing. Here's what the dude spent it on. And he tried to turn it into a conflict between the two of us. So they told me I couldn't be in the worship band anymore because I had this conflict with this other individual. And I'm like, I'm not really having a conflict with them. They stole and I caught them. I'm not really sure how somehow this results in being a conflict, but it was said. So that kind of soured my experience on churches, and eventually my wife and I just stopped going. And it was a shame because it said there was a lot of things that I really liked about it. And I think that churches can serve a very important function in society, especially for people that want to feel a sense of community. And I miss that. And but I don't think that I don't think that it hasn't destroyed my faith and curiosity in religion and my personal faith journey. Not at all. But it has just, I've always wanted to either write a book or maybe do something. Well, I'm doing it now that would present my type of scenario to people that run churches and let them know what it's like to be kind of not welcome. Because if a church is going to grow, if they're going to survive, you need people like me and my wife. I mean, we're not bad people. We may not give 10% of our income, but we'll give something. We'll give our time. We'll do what we can, and we'll try to be good members of the community. And it's on some level, it's very painful to feel that rejection, because I'm sure even as you listen, you're probably going, well, I mean, what the heck did Thom do to get pushed out of these different churches? And I don't think that same thing. I mean, is there something I've done? Was there something I said? Is there an abrasive component to my personality? I mean, I don't know. I really don't. And I think I should. I mean, if there was a situation where, I went into a church and I was a jerk and whatever, I get it. That's on me. But in the case of the last church I attended, I was invited there. Like, you invited me to come into your church, and then you don't want me there. I mean, I thought the whole purpose of faith and religion was, community and welcoming people and sinners. Hey, I'm a sinner. I got plenty of sins for you. But, and I think sometimes too, that whole mentality of, going back to the situation with that associate pastor that was having an affair, it was that sort of drive-through forgiveness that, this guy has an affair and we can forgive him. But that's not even necessarily just because it's a church. I mean, I feel like it should be that way in any faith. So, and as I use the title for this particular episode as Why Churches Hate Me, I think the weird thing is that I don't know. I really don't know. And I don't know why they hate me, and I don't know why they like some of the people that they do like. It's really hard for me to understand what it takes to be in the in crowd. What is it about an individual that makes them a good church member or a good person to serve on a church board or any of those types of things. And I think that's where, on so many levels, that churches really miss the boat. They missed an opportunity to find somebody like me who's ultimately a seeker, that would love to be around people that are curious, that are like-minded, that want to study stories in the Bible, that want to be at that level of faith that they see other people around them having, and it's difficult. And I'm sure it's difficult for a lot of people, but and I think many churches, one of the things that they do is that they do well in kind of a bad way is that they are able to kind of prey on you at a time when you're at your weakest. I mean, you're going to seek God. I believe in most cases people seek God when they're dealing with a tragedy. And I'm the same way. I certainly pray more about things when I'm not doing well than I do when things are going well. But you can't have the basis of your relationship with the people in your church, based on everybody just having horrible things going on. It should be on many levels a celebration, so you can bring some positive energy. And so I don't know. I'm 55 years old. The chances of me finding a church that I feel comfortable in are slim to none at this point. So I guess the disadvantage there is it's like, when I die, which church do I get buried in? Most likely a Catholic. But, yeah, so that's all I got. I mean, I said I don't know if there's necessarily a neat and tidy conclusion to this particular episode, but I hope that there's certainly people out there that that can relate to my experience, even if it's not something they experienced. Maybe it's something that they've seen happen to people they know, or again, if you're somebody that's a member of a church and maybe have always been curious about why maybe you invited a couple there and they don't come back. Maybe our experience will kind of shed some light on that as well. But either way, I just want to thank you for spending the time with me again on the Bagel Logic podcast, the podcast where we don't necessarily talk about bagels or necessarily talk about logic, but there's always politics and religion, isn't there? And I promise next episode we will have a guest, so we can break up my voice. Which, boy, man, did I talk it up today, didn't I? So, again, till next week, thank you so much, and we'll have another episode up within a few days. We're trying to get 2 of these out a week, and thank you again for listening to Bagel Logic Podcast.